Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, How Generations Give, Preparing for the Great Wealth Transfer. I am Paul Yekiayan. I'm a senior consultant at Benefactor Group, and I'm so glad that you could join us today. We all know that year-end fundraising is always a critical time for many nonprofits. There have been numerous tax policy changes and we want to be able to understand how some of these changes might have influenced donor behavior and giving strategies. Generational giving has been a hot topic for philanthropic research, and we know the subject is even more pertinent when in context with how people prepare for the great intergenerational transfer of wealth. In this presentation today, you're going to learn about the expected financial shifts, generational giving and preferences, as well as some actionable strategies to engage all of your donor base. So again, here's what to expect for today. You're going to be hearing from our panel of experts. Please feel free to post a question in the Q&A or in the chat. We will do our best to answer as many of those as we can during the presentation in the discussion afterwards. And again, just as a reminder, we will be sending this recording out to everyone along with the slide deck and some additional information that will be referenced later. So I'm joined by two of my colleagues at Benefactor Group who bring a wealth of knowledge and experience in philanthropy and fundraising. First is Laura McDonald, who's the founder and principal of Benefactor Group, also obviously a co-author of the research Generations and Giving. And Laura is also the recent author of the book, The Endowment Handbook, which I strongly recommend for anyone interested in endowment building. Laura has been in philanthropy for about 40 years, founded Benefactor in 2000. Her expertise spans campaigns, endowment strategy, philanthropic trends. Laura is often a frequent speaker and writer for publications such as Forbes, the Chronicle of Philanthropy, New York Times, and has led some major initiatives through her service at Giving USA Foundation, Giving Institute, and the Generosity Commission. Second, I am joined by Megan Simmons, a senior consultant and also a co-author of the Generations and Giving report. Megan brings more than a decade of fundraising communications and consulting experience. She leads Benefactor Group's fundraising communications practice, helping mission-driven organizations develop compelling cases for support, principal investor proposals, and donor-ready materials. Is also a frequent contributor to Nonprofit Quarterly, philanthropy.org. Currently serves as a board member for Giving USA Foundation and chairs the Giving USA editorial review. Again, my name is Paul Yekiayan. I am a senior consultant here at Benefactor Group and lead the firm's endowment product line. So with that, we are going to start looking at some historical giving data, kind of as a level set for everyone. And I'm going to ask Laura if she can talk a little bit about the results that we saw from the 2024 Giving USA report.
Great. Thank you, Paul. And thank you, everybody, for joining us either live here today or watching the recording. If you are live with us this afternoon, please, we'd love for this to be a conversation. Put your thoughts in the Q&A, and our colleague Jesse, who's in the background, will be sharing some of that with us so that we can address it. And those of you who do know me know that I geek out on this Giving USA data. And so we'll just do a quick refresher. When we take a look at the Giving USA data from 2024, remember 25 data will not be out until June of this year. So everybody circle that third Tuesday in June for the new Giving USA release. And when we look at where the charitable giving comes from, I think everybody on this webinar knows that the vast majority of charitable dollars come from individual donors who are giving their own money. It used to be higher than 66%, and some of that shift has gone to giving by foundations, which now represents almost 20% of all of the $592 billion given in 2024. But about half of that is coming from either closely held family foundations or donor advised funds, individuals making decisions about what used to be their own money. And then finally, we see that about 10% comes from bequests. That tends to be a very volatile sector because one ginormous bequest can really prop up the numbers one year, and it's hard to maintain that the next year. But we'll talk a little bit about how this intergenerational transfer of wealth may have a significant impact on that. When we look at the data, Giving USA data, the really good data goes back to about 1967. And I think we've all seen a chart that looks a lot like this at some time or another. And what we see here, I'll just unpack it for you a bit, is that the light green bars show the growth in charitable giving as adjusted for inflation. So those are inflation adjusted dollars. The darker green line shows charitable giving in current dollars, the world that most of us live in. The economists love to do the inflation adjusted dollars. Those of us who buy groceries tend to live in a current dollar world. And so that's really what we see. If you are interested in viewing more of this data, we've got a feature on the website that lets you click through a variety of different kind of economic and social conditions and how they have or haven't affected charitable giving over the last several decades. But when we really unpack it and say, how do those conditions affect it? Here, what you'll see is that those darker blue-green bars represent years in which there was a recession. And you'll see that oftentimes giving didn't grow as fast or even decline during recessions. The red dots indicate those years in which giving declined in current dollar terms. It doesn't always keep up with inflation, but it's in current dollar terms, it's declined only 5 times. And you'll see those on this chart. And what you'll see is that 2 of those, the very first one and the second to last one, had nothing to do with the economic conditions at the time. Those were years in which major tax reform took effect. And so what we tended to see was that in the year before that tax reform took effect, many donors rushed to give under the existing rules, which then led to a little bit of a hangover the next year. And some would say that for the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was in 2017, it was not just a hangover, but I think the research from the Lilly School of Philanthropy and others show that it really has dampened total philanthropy since it was adopted. So what happened last year? Major tax reform was adopted once again. I'll be very interested to see how the Giving USA data in June reflects this trend and whether or not, I know many of our clients in capital campaigns, in operating campaigns, saw a significant increase in fourth quarter giving last year. It'll be interesting to see if that's borne out by the data. I know we have a question about the 2020 peak. And what you will see is that, yes, actually it was in 2021, the charitable giving reached at that point, its all-time high. And this was an enormous outpouring of generosity from the American public in the midst of the headwinds of the pandemic, of the calls for social justice. I think that total giving grew to 2.3% of GDP. Usually it bumps around right around 2% of GDP. And you're saying to me, oh, Laura, what difference does 0.1% of GDP make? It makes about $80 billion worth of difference in today's economy. And so what we saw was that our charitable giving economy is elastic. It can grow. And we saw that in 2021. And then when you look at that decline the next year, the economists would simply say that that was reverting to the mean, that 2021 peak was an outlier, that if you look at the trend line, you'll see that leading up to 2024, it was much more of a natural trend line across those years. But, this really says to us that charitable giving is enormously resilient. I sometimes push back against those who say that nonprofit organizations can't be sustainable because they rely on charitable gifts. And yet we know that on average, going back to 1967, charitable giving grows almost every year. Grows a little bit more slowly during recessions. It did hit some stiff headwinds during the Great Recession, but mostly it grows. And the question that we have is, will the great intergenerational transfer of wealth have an impact on that growth? So when we go into the next set of slides, Paul, what we see is that somewhere in the neighborhood of $123 trillion is currently held by those who were born before 1964, the largest concentration of wealth held by any group in the history of the world, so far as we know. So it's an enormous amount of wealth. It is not distributed evenly. A small percentage of households have the vast majority of that. And some of it is still passing from the silent and mature generations, those born before 1945 who are still with us, and it's passing on to their children in the baby boom. But next, what we will see is that a significant portion of that then will go from baby boomers and their older siblings to the younger generations. The estimates right now are that $105 trillion will go to those younger generations. And in addition to that, $18 trillion will go to nonprofit organizations in the form of charitable bequests. And as you can see here, if that $18 trillion were all endowed, the draw on that would exceed total giving in 2024. And so that's an awesome opportunity that we all have. So when we think about this and think about how that will be distributed amongst those generations, what we see is a tremendous opportunity. Now, if every nonprofit in America received an equal portion of that $18 trillion, they would receive somewhere in the neighborhood of $12 to $13 million in new endowment. And wouldn't we all love that? But I think that what we know is that that won't be evenly distributed. The other thing that we sometimes hear is that, oh, only $18 trillion is going to the nonprofit sector, while 105 is going to those younger generations. Megan is really going to help us understand how those younger generations may use that to fuel their own charitable giving. But in the meantime, as we share some of our data with you, you'll see these statistics about how that is likely to be distributed amongst those younger generations. As you can see, baby boomers and their older siblings represent just under 25% of the population today, and we have attrition. Those generations are reaching the end of their lifetime, so they're not going to get any bigger. In the meantime, they're passing that wealth on, so they hold 25% of the population holds that $123 trillion in wealth. They'll be passing it on to the other generations. You know, the Gen X, much maligned Gen X, is a relatively small generation in terms of total population, and it too has pretty much stopped growing. It's the millennial Gen Y that is the ginormous opportunity and the ginormous generation that we see coming. What we also see are some really promising behaviors amongst that millennial generation, including, you know, the average household giving from that generation, the number of charities that they support. There's some indication that while baby boomers may support, as you can see here on average, a little over 4 charities, and they've pretty much picked those with whom they're having relationships. Well, I think Megan will talk about the fact that with the younger generations, they're still experimenting with who they're going to support and how they're going to support them. The other thing that I think is really hopeful in this slide is that we see that something in the neighborhood of 60% of millennials and Gen Zs are hopeful that they're going to give more next year than they've given in the past, whereas with the older generations, including Gen X, there are fewer folks, they're sort of more set in their giving budgets, and there are fewer of them that are hopeful that they're going to be giving more. I love this optimism that we hear from the younger generations, their experimentation and innovation, and their willingness to always continue giving more. So as we said, that data, certainly the Giving USA, unpacking that data is available on the website, and we'll be sharing these slides as well. But I think for some real understanding and unpacking of these data points and the behaviors of these younger donors, Megan, why don't you talk a little bit about the Generations in Giving special report that you and members of our team authored for Giving USA. And first of all, some of the impetus to do that, and then what some of the findings that came to you as you were working on that.
I would be happy to. And I'll also just acknowledge a question that was raised in the Q&A about larger perhaps patterns or changes in who is giving and who is receiving over time. And just to quickly touch on that, I think Jesse will send some links to resources that go a little bit deeper, but individuals, as you saw, are responsible for the lion's share of total giving by far. As a portion of the overall pie, this segment has decreased as some other factors are at play, like individuals transitioning their giving to family foundations and DAFs. Corporate giving is most closely tied to pre-tax profits. So when pre-tax profits grow, so does corporate giving. However, the pace of that growth has been much different over time. So even though pre-tax profits have really flourished in recent years, we've seen that corporate giving has remained, I'll say stuck between 5 and 7% of overall giving. And then the
And
question
Megan, I think we'd also say that corporate giving is going to face some real headwinds in the coming years because of that recent tax change.
100%. And we'll be really interested to see this year's Giving USA report and future Giving USA reports about how those impacts are felt. And then last, I'd say, because it connects to what Laura was just sharing about the intergenerational wealth transfers, that bequests fluctuate from year to year, have largely remained between 7 and 9% of total giving. On the horizon, this could be changing. We think that this great transfer of wealth is going to be a huge influence on that. So just to share a little bit more, and Jesse will drop some links to resources to go even deeper. But yes, to talk a little bit about giving and generations, this is a perennial favorite topic, and a lot of research has been produced on it. There have been a number of seminal studies over the past 10 to 15 years exploring differences in generations. And recently, we wanted to compile and sort of synthesize and look at all that's been learned all together in one place. So I'm really excited to share with you all some of the findings and big takeaways that we would share from our literature review. Before I do that, I think before we talk about how different generations give, I really do want to share a little bit about who they are. So you can see on this slide, it highlights patterns of things like political affiliation, demographic diversity, education levels, marriage rates, average net worth across generations. And I share this because these are really important factors that remind us that giving is shaped by more than the year you were born. So, right, rates of marriage might affect your charitable decision making within your household. Your wealth accumulation might inform the magnitude of giving decisions. And things like political affiliation can really shape values. There was a report recently that looked at differences in giving among groups by gender, age, and ideology. And between millennials and boomers, the greatest difference recorded in giving behavior was measured at 32%. The greatest difference between those who identify as liberals and those who identify as conservatives was 300%. So those are some of the factors at play. Similarly, some of these behavioral differences that we're going to be talking about are more likely a result of life stage rather than generation. So maybe a recent college graduate with limited financial resources will be more comfortable giving a little each month or giving sporadically, while perhaps an older couple who has built that financial stability may find a donor advised funds helps them to organize their giving. When you look at all these things together, it just reminds us that philanthropy is influenced by many factors. And smart fundraisers, like all those on this webinar today, are going to account for these different intersecting characteristics. But with that foundation, we can go to the next slide to talk a little bit about the trends and patterns we do see when it comes to donors of different generations. So, question one, what kinds of causes do different generations support? And first, I'd share that, as Laura pointed to, interestingly, reports have suggested that currently older generations tend to spread their giving across a greater number of causes each year, while younger generations tend to concentrate their philanthropy on a smaller number of causes or nonprofits. As for the types of causes most frequently supported by each generation, we see some similarities and we see some differences. So, starting with similarities, across all generations, giving to religious organizations remains the top priority. This is in line with what Laura had shared. Our larger industry trends are Giving USA data. Religion is the long-standing top recipient of US charitable giving. As for differences, older generations are more likely to give to education and the arts, while younger generations are more likely to favor environmental and social justice issues. Younger generations are also what we might call issue driven, which means they care really deeply about causes rather than feeling loyal to specific, perhaps, organizations. So, a younger donor who cares deeply about pediatric health as a cause might give to their local children's hospital one year and then the next year give to a national disease focused association. And I would say what we can learn here is that successful organizations will find ways to position themselves across several cause areas, because that increases the likelihood that you can appeal to more donors of different generations. For example, we're working with a wonderful museum with a mission at the intersection of art and conservation. They really have the opportunity to lean into both causes, to talk art with donors who care about different eras or different forms, and to talk conservation with those who care about their gifts impacting our wildlife and wildlands. So if we go to the next slide, we can also think about trends and how different generations prefer to communicate and prefer to be communicated with. And I would say across the board, right, more Americans are turning to digital communications and especially consuming information through video. So, if we took a guess, I don't think it would surprise us to know that the average American now checks their phone 205 times per day, and that 93% of Americans receive at least some of their news online, with a significant portion happening through video. So while it's happening across the board, I think unsurprisingly, younger generations, millennials and Gen Z, are continuing to lead this trend. They demonstrate a distinct preference for online giving. They are the most likely to make gifts via smartphone or via other online forms. They are uniquely responsive to solicitations received through text or through social media, and they are most likely to rely on social media when it comes to researching a new organization, either in place of or in addition to perhaps using that organization's website. I would also say that younger donors are eager to maintain regular contact with nonprofits. So there was a study that came out that showed that after making a gift, 82% of Gen Z donors said that they would welcome at least monthly contact with a nonprofit, monthly outreach, compared to 64% of millennials, 36% of Gen X, and only 19% of boomers. And in particular, expressed an affinity for digital communications. So more than half of the Gen Z respondents in this survey said that they subscribed to nonprofit email lists and had enthusiasm for things like receiving program updates and client success stories.
Megan, I'll just observe that that's some really helpful data to have at hand when you are in the boardroom and your board members, who probably represent the older generations that you just cited, um, make comments about the amount of information that's going out is too frequent or overwhelming. And yet here we have this data that says that their children or their nieces and nephews are craving that frequency. So that's where I think some of this is really important.
Yes, 100%. And a theme that we'll continue to convey is that these are certainly national trends being felt, but this is also I hope this becomes the starting point for your own discovery to go and learn what your donors are craving and to ask your donors these very questions and to have even more tailored information for the board when you bring it back to them. So, Paul, if we could go to the next slide, we'll also talk a little bit about giving methods. And I would just say here that as for giving methods, we can see a couple of things that older generations are more likely to explore strategies that maximize tax efficiency. And meanwhile, similar to eager for continued contact and communication, younger generations are also eager for further education. So we know that many millennials and Gen Zers are not aware of all of the ways in which they can optimize their giving. So another report that we included in our literature review found that one third of folks of these next generations were not familiar with tactics like donor advised funds, impact investments, or giving circles, just other opportunities for having an impact on the causes that they love and feel passionately about. And the takeaway here that I would share is that staying informed and educated about the advantages of different giving options is so important because when you are able to counsel a curious donor on the best avenues to achieve their philanthropic goals, their opinion of your organization grows, and you move from that place of development officer to philanthropy advisor, which Laura will talk a little bit more about after we share this last piece of information, which is other factors that influence perhaps giving decisions and behavior. I'm just going to share a few examples here. So, we've seen from our research that the silent generation and boomers tend to be more planful, reporting that they map out their giving in advance. And for these donors, the takeaway could be being sure that you are presenting a really cohesive, comprehensive invitation to give when you do so, and not piecemealing a solicitation here and 3 months later, another solicitation there. Another example of what we can learn about different generations' behaviors is that Generation X is the most active volunteer cohort today. They volunteer the most on average at 39 hours annually, and more than half, about 57%, say that they volunteer in addition to their financial contributions. So, for these folks, finding opportunities to engage them in ways beyond their giving is a really valuable opportunity, and tracking and celebrating those contributions of time and talent as well. And then last, I'd share that, millennials and Gen Z, in addition to everything we've talked about so far, tend to identify more than other generations with labels outside of philanthropist or donor or some of those traditional giver language. So, considering how you can tailor your communications to these folks in ways that emphasize other elements of their identity as a volunteer, as an advocate, as a change maker more broadly. So, those are some of the big takeaways and findings we would share. If you're interested in reading the full report, we'll have some resources to go a little bit deeper on some of these headlines as well. But with that, I'll turn it, I think, to Laura to talk about how to turn this into action.
The a couple of things, Megan. One, I'll let you think for a moment about a question that came in is where email ranks amongst the contact methods with the various generations. I think it was implied in some of those, but not explicit in them. And while you're thinking about that, I will also share that when we look particularly at those older generations that have accumulated assets, our friend Russell James recently came out with a study that showed that organizations that focus on talking to their donors about gifts of assets grow considerably faster than organizations that only talk about gifts of current resources of cash, or are silent about the source of a donor's generosity. And so really acquainting yourself and being able to talk about gifts of assets, not just gifts of cash, or, and in particular for those younger generations, writing a check, which they don't do anymore. So, Megan, any thoughts about that question about where email falls amongst those contact methods? Is it pretty ubiquitous?
Yes, and I don't have the exact numbers right in front of me, but yes, to share that and to share that as we might expect that appeals still work. And when you look at who they work best with, direct mail and email appeals do tend to resonate most with those older generations, our boomers and our silent gen. Interestingly, the way it has been linked to digital giving for some of these folks is that the receiving the direct mail appeal can lead folks to make an online gift of those older generations.
Right. And I think there have been some older studies that also suggested that multi-channel connection, where it might be the email or it might be the newsletter or it might be the banner on the side of the building, but that when those are coordinated messages that come through multiple channels, an organization is also much more likely to retain that donor. And at the end of the day, all of this should be not just about securing a gift, but really establishing a relationship with a donor.
I also
So,
want to take a minute to respond to Julia's question about might the younger generation's interest in being identified as something other than a donor mean things like membership are on their eyes. I would say yes. And I think thinking about a donor's identity as more than how frequently they give or how much they give, but rather what they're interested in, why they're motivated to support you in whatever ways they support you. That's how, how they think about themselves. And the more we can communicate that, as a teacher, as a parent, some of those other elements of those identities, I think help donors feel heard and understood in ways that are beyond the ways in which they support your organization as a donor or as a member.
I think that's right, Megan, and I think it goes beyond. For a long time, membership has been about a quid pro quo relationship, an exchange of value. I'm a member, and therefore I receive X, free admission, discounted parking, whatever it might be. I think Paul came across a quote recently that I thought was terrific, which is we're now shifting from our understanding of the membership as transactional to membership as a sense of belonging. And so, how are you infusing that membership relationship, not with, your grandparents' membership, but rather with the kind of you belong to us. And that really, I think, then helps the donor form that identity. I am a member of XYZ's family. And that's really, I think, what we should be striving for authentically. So let's spend just a few minutes talking about some of the things that have grown out of this for us from this and a lot of other good research. I know that Megan and I, and Paul for that matter, are all really interested in the work of the behavioral economists and the neurobiologists who are working in this space. Fascinating stuff. And, I think that they would say that one of the primary reasons that donors don't give is that there is at least a momentary thought of loss aversion. Um, and then if we talk about planned giving, layer on top of that mortality aversion. So some, at least momentarily in the parts of the brain that process these things, there is a moment of loss aversion. But we have four powerful tools that we can use to overcome that loss aversion. And I think in many ways, these transcend generation and have a lot more to do with some of the other differences that Megan spoke about with donors. So the first is talking to your donor as the agent of change. And I think that this is particularly important the younger they are. So that rather than saying that when you give to our organization, we make a change in the world, the language shifts to something more along the lines of your gift makes a change in the world. So you become the vessel, but the donor is the agent of change. Interestingly, there are some breakdowns both by political ideology and especially by gender about the extent to which a donor wants to be a singular agent of change versus in a community of change makers. And again, these are some kind of things that you can suss out by really tracking how your own donors behave, perhaps A/B testing email subject lines, some other ways in which you can really see how they respond to being the agent of change. The second is the hero story. And it sounds deceptively simple, but our friend Russell James has written 400-page books about it. So there's a lot to dissect here. But if you've been to any recent movie, let's see, what were my grandkids watching recently? Moana and Frozen. And they're all hero stories, right? Where you've got the hero has a beginning state, goes on a journey. The journey might be filled with challenges and arrives at an elevated state. Using that hero story in our fundraising communications is essential. And it's important to do it that in a way that we do not devolve to what some people call philanthropy porn, that we can't exploit people's stories. We need to be authentic. We need their permission to tell their stories. And as we tell them, Jacob Harold used to say, no data without stories, no stories without data. Stories create the fertile soil where the impact messages can take root. And so talking about whether it's somebody who's benefited from your programs, a donor, one of your colleagues who is a caregiver or a frontline worker, but telling that hero story over and over again. And then for the planned giving messages, converting it into the perpetual hero story is really how we overcome that mortality aversion. The third is social norming. And social norming, we can boil down to one simple statement. People like you make gifts like this to an organization like ours. So it's a three-part statement. People like you make gifts like this to an organization like ours. But we have to be really attentive to each one of those three ingredients. I'll give you an example. I recently had a milestone birthday where the mail and my snail mail in my mailbox changed considerably. And one of the organizations my husband and I have supported sent a postcard. And on the back of it, there was information about attending an information session about estate planning and planned giving. When I turned it over, it had a picture of a woman considerably older than I am in a rocking chair knitting. That is not a person like me. I'm sure she's a lovely person, but I did not identify with that woman. And so you have to be very careful. People like you make gifts like this. We can use that. We used an example where sometimes we might want to challenge group members of one group to match the giving of another group. But what happens if this group has the capacity to give considerably more? We don't necessarily want them to make gifts like that. So, and then to an organization like ours, or to a cause, or to the particular campaign that you're running. So I think that's really social norming. Some people at times have called it the cool kids club, that, all the cool kids give to our organization. But you've got a lot of tools that you can use to create this social norming. One of them is conferring insider status. Um, People like to feel that sense of belonging that we spoke of earlier. I think that's why membership programs are transcending the mere quid pro quo transactional model and really becoming a way in which to confer insider status. And you can do that, the typical donor, it's fine with them if there are 10,000 other insiders. I just want to know that I'm an insider. So this does not need to, nor should it be, an elitist model or an exclusionary model. But we are bringing to you, and we've got the ability now to bring customized messages to share with you things before they're shared with the general public. So really using that notion of insider status to confer that sense of belonging upon our donors. And all of that, Paul, I think really changes the role that we all think of ourselves in as development officers. This is a piece that I recently wrote for Forbes.com, and in fact, I'm talking to the Chronicle of Philanthropy later this week. They're going to be coming out with a similar article that I think that it shifts the responsibility of those who work in this field. There are a lot of misunderstandings about what we do, and some of them are kind of unkind, but they feel like they kind of put us in the position of a supplicant who is always asking for money, which is not what most of us do or want to do. But I really do think that it shifts our responsibility to become someone who is really a partner with that donor and helping them to center their philanthropic passions, to figure out what resources they have to advance their philanthropic aspirations. And so we really become more of an advisor. And yes, there are people who are certified advisors in philanthropy who know all about the various gifts. Those are important people. That's not exactly what I'm describing here. What I'm describing is somebody who knows when to call in that expert with all of their technical skill, or somebody who knows when to take the donor on a behind the scenes tour. So really becoming that trusted advisor to our donors, which I think, A, may inform the titles that we use for our roles, but also I think gives us all a lot more fulfillment in the roles that we play. I think, Megan, you also had drew some conclusions from your work on this. And before you come off mute and answer that, I also just wanted to make sure that I recognize that there was a third co-author of this special report, a brilliant intern who's been with the firm now for 2 or 3 years, Ria Akilish. So I wanted to make sure that Ria got a shout out in today's webinar. Megan.
Yes, we could not have done this without Ria's wonderful work. But to add to what you've shared, Laura, and I think that this idea of moving from asking to advising really captures it. But Paul, if you go to the next slide, I think we want to be aware of generation as a variable in our donors' giving behaviors. So capturing age, capturing generation, it's important. But I would say using it as a starting place to learn more about these donors and the other parts of their identities that, again, influence how they think of themselves and therefore what motivates them to support your cause. And together that information, I'll use this to respond to Meredith's really good question about should we be using, universal language that speaks to everyone or trying to segment and tailor accordingly. And I'd encourage folks to tailor and customize communications to these different donor identities that you find work for your organization or make sense for your organization. And to figure out what works for your organization, test, track, frequently reassess, and see what's working and what's not. Recognizing that, this is just one variable. So again, using surveys, using other feedback tools, having those discovery conversations with your donors to learn about what shapes they're giving holistically. Those are the biggest takeaways I'd offer. And at UC Embrace the Digital Age, we did hear about how overall, across generations, that is becoming an increasingly important tool in our communications. So, certainly embracing digital, embracing video, but above all, treating our donors not just about how much they give or how frequently they give, but by what they care about, by what shapes who they are and how they think about themselves.
And I'd say that that can sound overwhelming.
Yeah.
The reality is that for your organization, there may be 3 or 4 personae. You needn't slice and dice this into a matrix of dozens of characteristics. That I think you'll find that 80% of the work can be done through identifying just a handful of different cohorts that you'll want to speak to individually. The other thing I'll say is that what you haven't heard in this webinar and what we should probably address in a future one is also how you can use the tools of AI to
Mhm.
better do some of this work. With that, I think, Paul, we were going to turn to the audience. We've worked in a lot of the audience questions as we've gone, and Jesse
Yes.
will continue to let us know if any come in. But I think you had a few that you wanted to ask as well.
One of the questions that I have is around, you know, uh, fundraisers are busy. We often work in small shops. How do we take this information in an effective way to segment and to test and to do these things? Understanding that there is generational transfer of wealth, understanding that generations have different perspectives on giving. What are some thoughts? And Megan, you talked about it a little bit, but just, how does a small shop, two, three individuals, how do they start to incorporate this, test this in a cost-effective way while really honoring donor intent?
Well, I would share a example of a smaller shop that we've worked with that used a donor survey as a first tool to gather some of this information about what donors care about and keeping it short, keeping it streamlined, keeping it focused on what has motivated you to be part of our community of supporters? What is it that you care about and want to learn and hear more about? And some of the questions that, we know that influence retention and loyalty, like, where does this organization rank among your philanthropic priorities? So for them, that was a useful way of just beginning to gather the information that helped to sort of shape personas and shape some initial segmentation of appeals that didn't require, this lift of having one-on-one conversations with every donor in their database. But Laura, I'd invite you to share ad.
I think that's right, and it's you don't need to try to do everything all at once. I think pick a few things that would make sense for your organization, and it may be different from a animal welfare organization than for an art museum. But it could be simply, in addition to that survey that Megan spoke about, perhaps it is A/B testing of some email subject lines. Maybe do randomly half of your list gets a subject line that really makes the donor the singular agent of change, and the other half get a subject line that puts them in a community of change agents. So think about using some of those simple tools and then track, because if you do that, but you don't do anything with the data, you might as well have not taken the time to segment your list in that way. But just begin small, begin with what you can do, record what you're learning, and then build upon it as you move forward. I think that that's really important.
Hmm.
I know there's a question in the Q&A about related to this, which is, okay, if you're going to begin to address them or use some messaging strategies based on their generation? Should we ask their age on their donor forms? And I would say no. Many people find that to be intrusive. Instead, I would do one of two things. I would give the broad ranges that align with the generations and ask them to check which generate what year, what was your birth year, and give them a broad range that they can check within. Or don't even do that. There are lots and lots of data sources that are cheap that will append your database with their birth year. So they're publicly available ways in which you can know this without the donor feeling as though you're getting all up in their business.
Good. Laura, Megan, thanks for that. One question I have is, as you conducted the research and prepared this report, what surprised you the most?
Well, I'll start and then Megan, you can go because one of the things that surprised me and some of the genesis for this work was the research that I was doing when I wrote the endowment handbook. And I wanted to think a little bit about how different generations approached giving to endowment in particular. And what I found was that there were both some through lines in all of the different data, but also some remarkable inconsistencies. And I thought, wait a minute, what am I going to make of this? And so that's when our colleague Ria started putting together a massive spreadsheet with all of the reports we could find, learning that many of them trace back to a couple of seminal reports, as Megan stated. And then we began to be able to see the through line. And that's why we felt the literature review would be beneficial to share with others. Megan, what surprised you?
I think that just the theme of intersections, right? That it's not age alone that influences any of these differences that we've talked about, but that intersection of age and generation and some of these other, factors and parts of who we are. And as one example that I don't think we've spoken to yet, we know that the philanthropic landscape is going to be increasingly shaped by the rising influence of a new generation of female donors. So by 2035, $30 trillion in wealth will be transferred to younger women, mostly the children of current boomers. And thinking about some of what we know about women's giving, women tend to think longer term. They are less likely, according to some research, to have discussed philanthropic strategies with an expert or an advisor. One study showed that 19% of millennial women have had a charitable planning conversation with a financial advisor, compared to 33% of their male peers. So using this as another opportunity to be that advisor, to serve in that role of not fundraising supplicant, but as philanthropic advisor and partner to our donors.
Good. Thanks for that, Megan. As you did the research, and you mentioned, the importance of women giving, and I know that there is some research around that, but what gaps do you think exist in the current research, and what opportunities might there be for doing, some deeper analysis or looking at, other additional factors that may affect future giving and generational transfer of wealth?
I think that the studies that we primarily looked at, the big studies that are out there, take a broad view of how Americans of different generations approach philanthropy. They are mostly based on self-reported survey data, and they are often limited to either individuals who have given recently or individuals who have given. So they do not include those who are non-donors. I think those would be interesting elements to explore. I also think that what we've talked about, where some of these changes and differences might be more attributed to life stage rather than to generation, would be really interesting to understand further.
Okay. Laura, do you have any thoughts on that or?
No, I think Megan nailed it. And we are avid consumers of giving research in charitable giving and philanthropy, and so we would really encourage those kinds of additional studies to be done. I think too, as Megan alluded, many studies ask donors how they plan to behave in the future. Ask me how many times I plan to go to the gym next week. You'll get a much more accurate answer if you ask me how many times I went to the gym last week. And so I think that also ensuring that the research methods that we're using and the studies that we're leaning into are those that are really using some things that are going to be much more predictive of future behavior. I think speaking of gaps, I know that there's a question that's come in through the Q&A, Paul, about gaps.
Yes, sorry if I'm missing it.
It's uh, it's about the generosity gap with younger generations
Oh,
that
yes,
the,
yes.
the media sometimes plays up this generosity gap and that younger donors aren't as generous as their older siblings or parents. And as the person who submitted this question said, we don't believe that this research supports that. I think a couple of things happening. One, as we said, those younger donors tend to be loyal to a cause or an issue. And so they may choose to give to pediatric cancer research one year, their local children's hospital the next, and the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation the year after that. And so those organizations, which can't track across organization, feel as though those donors are not sticky, that they're moving around. And yet, what we know from the macro level, when we look at the economic data, they really are giving very generously. The other thing that we know is that some of the assumptions we make about the barriers to giving are may seem logical, but they really aren't borne out by the data. For example, we did a project with a highly regarded liberal arts institution that really wanted to deeply to understand why their younger generations of graduates weren't giving back in as high a proportion as their earlier graduates. And they had assumptions that it was things like student loan debt. We've seen studies that suggest that students are more likely to give back to their alma mater if they received financial aid, a scholarship, or even loans. And as we talked about this as a firm, really what came to us is that those students who made their way through school, patching together financial aid and student loans, really have a sense of gratitude for the institutions that helped them along in that journey. Whereas perhaps those who are full pay students maybe have a little bit more of a sense of entitlement. I paid my dues. I don't owe you anything more. So I think we need to be really careful about bringing assumptions to why donors do or don't behave in a certain way. A lot of things are counterintuitive, and let's make sure that we're going back to the data to find that out. But I would say that I have great hopes. Some of the concerns about particularly Gen X being less generous, just keep reminding yourself it's a much smaller generation. There are fewer of them. And so collectively, they don't have enough butts to fill all the board seats. They don't have enough wallets to replace the number of individuals who gave in the baby boomer generation. But wait, the millennials are coming along and they're going to be great. And those Gen Xers who are participating in our nonprofit ecosystem, we should applaud them because they're carrying a lot of burden for a relatively smaller generation.
Thanks for that, Laura. And as a Gen Xer, I appreciate the call out because we often
I
get
think we have three
ignored.
generations represented on the screen here. I'm just gonna
Right,
guess.
right. So I know our time is coming to a close, but wanted to ask one more question of you. I know Benefactor Group embraces a concept of abundance, and from all this research, all the things that you've been doing, Megan, and Laura, what gives you hope for the future of philanthropy?
I think that for me, it's two things. It's first what Laura spoke to earlier, that giving is resilient. That is one of the truths of the all the decades we've been tracking this data about American giving through Giving USA, and that it will continue to be that folks, want to be generous and they want to support causes and their communities. And the other, I think, promising component are some of these positive data points we're seeing come about millennial and Gen Z donors, about the next generation. So we know that and this might address one of the questions that had been raised earlier, that currently boomers give at the highest average levels of outpacing other generations. And given relative wealth accumulation, this is not surprising. But millennials and Gen X and Gen Z are all continuing to demonstrate really promising generosity. There were two reports that were a sequence. So one came out in 2022, the next came out in 2024. And between those two reports, every generation, we saw an increase in their generosity. We saw an increase in their average giving. So I think this underscores the sort of potential of our younger and next generation donors and the upward trajectory we hope to continue to cultivate and see.
And I think that's right, Megan. And if we strip away, we have the opportunity to do work in a lot of communities in America, some outside of the United States, and we know that we can get very wrapped up in our language, talking about philanthropy and philanthropists. But if we strip all that away and return it to its essence, one of the things that we saw in the work of the Generosity Commission is that this human impulse to be generous exists. And sometimes we're actually obstructing it with our language. So if we return to simpler language, as you said, the younger generation doesn't really embrace the title philanthropist, but simply to say friend, ally, uh, giver, whatever it might be, that's when we really find that that common impulse can be activated on behalf of the organizations that do great work in America and beyond.
Wonderful. Well, with that, we are going to come to a close. First, I want to thank everyone for joining us today, but a big thanks to Laura McDonald and Megan Simmons for sharing some really great insights and expertise. We really hope that today's webinar gave you some practical takeaways, ways to strengthen fundraising, planned giving, navigating your way around the great generational wealth transfer with some added confidence. Just as a reminder, you are going to receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording. You will get a copy of the slide deck and along with some additional resources. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. We are happy to continue the conversation. On behalf of the three of us and the entire team at Benefactor Group, I want to thank you for the work that you all do every day to advance your missions and to serve the common good. And with that, I'm going to wish you a wonderful, wonderful day. Thank you so much.